a question. For our upcoming panel about VFA regulations, our moderator, Wayne Pisani, partner at Grant Thornton.
Good afternoon, everyone. The next panel is tasked with asking the question whether Malta has gone a step too far in the regulation of the virtual financial asset space. And we'll be joined by a team of professionals hailing from the legal, compliance solutions, and banking advisory area. So I start by inviting David Carlisle to the panel, who is from Elliptic. Dr. Leonard Bonello from Ganado Advocates. Mark Curmi from KPMG. And Dr. Carl Brincat from the Malta Gaming Authority. Thank you, guys. So, have we gone a step too far? Before we kick off, I would like to invite the panelists to present a little bit short profile about themselves. Perhaps David, you could go.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Carlisle. I work for Elliptic. We're a provider of blockchain analytics solutions that enable banks, cryptocurrency exchanges, and other financial institutions to meet their anti-money laundering regulations. So those include solutions that allow cryptocurrency businesses to scrutinize their customer transactions, determine if funds are flowing to dark web marketplaces or other illicit sources, and ensure that they can manage those risks and report illicit activity to law enforcement.
Leonard?
I am Leonard Bonello, a partner at Ganado Advocates. I had the FinTech practice group within the office. My background is as a financial regulatory lawyer, but I'm with a keen interest in FinTech. And right now I'm being held very busy with a number of crypto exchanges through the application process.
Mark?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Mark Curmi. I'm a director at KPMG. My role and responsibility is banking, financial institutions, and VFA regulatory services. I'm also part of the global team at KPMG on blockchain.
Carl?
Hi everyone, I'm Carl from the Malta Gaming Authority. I'm Chief Legal and Enforcement, and my duties include the maintenance of the regulatory obligations stemming from the Sandbox framework.
Okay. I'm Wayne, partner at Grant Thornton and president of the FSP and governor of Finance Malta. So, regulation. Ultimately, it's a means of codifying expectations or what should happen. And I'll start with Leonard. As Leonard put it, if there's no regulation, then anyone who regulates, it's certainly over-regulation. So why did Malta take this approach?
I think, again, the first point is a philosophical one. Is regulation a barrier? And perhaps technologists seek to see, technologists think in global terms. They want a world without barriers. So perhaps they see regulation as a hindrance in what they're doing. But let's say from our background as lawyers, as legal professionals, we see regulation as something which can enable you. So at a point in time where we had a crypto vacuum, where you don't know whether you are merely tolerated, so you are providing services from a jurisdiction, but you are at their whim, and it depends on whether all of a sudden Japan changes its attitude to the crypto industry, or whether the US changes its position. I think regulation was important to give clarity and to give legal certainty to the operators that wanted to set up shop in a specific jurisdiction. And Malta provided that opportunity. Now, I think, again, we need to think of a historical context, because decisions are taken and strategic decisions are taken at a specific point in time. I believe that when decision was taken at which level to pitch regulation, you are looking at a situation where Malta as a jurisdiction was under a heavy spotlight in terms of grabbing perhaps the news for some of the wrong titles. It was generally an industry where you need to be quite brave to regulate or to take that leap. There are some misconceptions that simply because you're regulating, you're providing a safe haven, which is far from the truth. But I think something which we also need to keep in mind is that perhaps as a country we have been the victims of our success. I mean, some of the operators which are set up here are amongst the largest players in the world. When you have these large players, from an investor protection point of view, you can't afford to allow a free rein. So you need to make sure that the regulatory framework you're putting in place is solid enough, is tough enough to resist the test of the global players we have here. And sometimes I like to reply to the statement that perhaps there's over-regulation by asking, okay, but what is the cost of under-regulating in the industry? And I think that cost is a much higher cost which the jurisdiction would have had to pay.
So, Mark, looking at the application of the technology to financial services, do you perceive that we took, or Malta took, a prudent approach in terms of regulating the space the way it did?
Did Malta take a prudent approach in the space they need? Okay, so it's obviously following up on what I think my personal view, following up on what Leonard is saying. So you look at the wider regulation from a DLT perspective for financial services, you're looking at two different regulators, MFSA and MDIA. Now, if we're going to talk about did we take a prudent approach, we need to start off by understanding what would have been a prudent approach to regulation, right? So Leonard, we're talking about over-regulation, we're talking about did we over-regulate, did we not? I think it's a question of assessing what we mean by over-regulation before going into understanding the prudence part of it. So I won't go into what Leonard said, I agree totally with what he said. If you talk about applying certain regulations that had to be taught up, had to be cooked up, okay? And cooked up in an industry where, excuse me, all other jurisdictions, or most other jurisdictions, either issued guidance when it comes to regulatory infrastructures for financial related entities in the VFA, in the crypto space, and a number of jurisdictions who did not even consider having regulations from a DLT perspective. So I think from a Maltese perspective, I don't think it's a question of have we been too prudent. I think we had to set a standard. As a jurisdiction, we are setting a certain level for the type of entities we want to attract. Let's be fair, Malta has been under fire in various areas of regulation over the past months, if not over a year now. And we need to protect the jurisdiction. So yes, the regulations that have been issued, in my view, I don't think are in a situation where we're over-regulating. I think we needed to be prudent. I also believe that this is a learning experience. So what we've seen today with the with the MDIA blockchain AI guidelines that have just been issued, just from a certification perspective. So we're testing the market here, right? There's a guidance, a document, these are guidelines. It's something which is going to help the industry grow. If you look at the systems audit point, which is where obviously you're getting to from a DLT perspective, yes, it's a regime. Yes, it pulls into the law, but it's a certification, okay? And we wanted to make sure that we bring in, as a jurisdiction, the various key players get certification and be able also to provide that service. Let me be frank. We talk about regulation as if it could potentially be a bad thing. But in reality, all the players that are currently here are going to need to have services from other financial services related entities. Financial services related entities that are under the barrage of multiple regulations. So if I were a bank, if I were a financial institution, if I were an insurance company, why would I service an entity that, one, is reluctant to get regulated, two, doesn't want to have parts of its technology regulated? So with all due respect, I think we have not, it's not a question of us being prudent. I think, yes, we have been prudent. I think we have rightly so been prudent. Yes, it's a journey. Yes, we need to tweak. Yes, we are all here because we want to tweak this. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity that we have a framework with which we can play around with. My last point, because I really believe that is important, is that the largest regulator, or one of the largest regulators in the EU, BaFin, has 2 months ago issued clear directives that any cryptocurrency service provider from 1st of January 2020 needs to have a license under MiFID or some variant of the regime. So I think Malta's on the right track, yes? So I think we need to start a round of applause for the regulators on what they're doing here, and stakeholders.
So, Carl, touching on what Mark is saying, that we've seen even large regulators following suit or large jurisdictions. I mean, coming from the gaming authority, and obviously it's a business which Malta regulated in the region of 15 years ago, and we were amongst the first movers there. Same thing, the MGA was amongst the first movers to issue guidelines on the DLT space. What's your experience with the way the MGA approached the DLT space in terms of the sandbox and even the guidelines issued?
The ethos behind the move was very much the same as it was, I think, back then when Malta originally regulated remote gaming. The reason being that we saw an innovation happening, we saw that it could be a very big shift with regards to certain operations, and therefore we had a decision to make. Is it something that should be, for some reason or other, prohibited? No, not really. It is an enabler, as any other technology, and therefore we decided, let's assess the risks. I concur very much with what Leonard and Mark were saying, and that was the approach that we took. What are, if any, the additional risks that these technologies are going to bring into the regulated industry? And that is where the process of studying the risks kicked off. That is where the design of the mitigating measures kicked off, and being something very new, being something, as Mark said as well, being something where we were the first movers, even as a country, we didn't really have a lot of previous experience of other regulators to draw on outside of our shores. So what we did was we brought in the industry, we consulted very heavily in order to make sure that insofar as possible, what we were trying to achieve, the restrictions and mitigating measures that we were putting in place were reasonable for the purpose, and that is where the sandbox came about. The reason why sandbox is a bit of a misnomer, because they are obligations over and above the normal licensing process, rather than taking out of normal obligations. But the reason why it was structured in that way is because the gaming industry in general is a very dynamic one. But in this particular area, even more so, we need to be very responsive with changes to the requirements when changes in the technology happen. And that is effectively where we are at now. Did we strike the balance? I think, as the previous panelists have pointed out, we had to be prudent. The risk of under-regulation cannot be underestimated, because here, even in our industry, we are speaking of funds pertaining to third parties. We are speaking of a regulated business. We are speaking of a business which is very much in the spotlight. So the cost of under-regulating would have been very high. Has the balance been struck? I'm not sure. Maybe we need to revisit the barrier to entry in certain circumstances, but the objective and the approach underpinning is always the same. What are we trying to achieve? And the requirements that we are imposing, are they proportionate? Are they sufficient? Or are they perhaps excessive compared to what we are trying to achieve? And that is why it is very much a learning process, even for us.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. David, we've heard the regulatory side. So what the regulator tried to accomplish in setting the rules. However, then you need to implement and ensure that whatever has been envisaged is effectively in place and efficacious. From your experience as a compliance solutions provider at Elliptic and so forth, what are you seeing the dynamics of working within a regulated environment and also those environments which are not as heavily regulated possibly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think it's important to recognize that what's happening here in Malta, developments over the past couple of years from a regulatory perspective, aren't just happening in a vacuum. There's a global trend towards greater regulation in the crypto space. For example, earlier this year in June 2020, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard setter for anti-money laundering regulation, issued extensive guidance that basically sets out how countries and how cryptocurrency businesses should go about implementing anti-money laundering regulation. And so if there was previously sort of a notion that if one country is regulating you, you can just run to another country and hope that they don't regulate you, I think those days are coming to an end. We still see sort of a patchwork international system in terms of how regulation is implemented and enforced, but increasingly the bar is rising. And so I think any crypto business who wants to be successful really needs to understand that that's sort of the state of play at the moment, and they can't just expect to hide from regulation anymore. Now, I think at Elliptic, we work with cryptocurrency exchanges and businesses here in Malta, in the US, Japan, all over the world. And I think those that we see are successful ultimately are the ones who sort of embrace from a very early stage that they need to be compliant and that they need to make sure that compliance can work for them. I think the notion of compliance can be quite daunting to a startup company or someone in a new emerging space. But what we tend to find is that those companies that are proactive about it, the ones that get software like ours that enables them to manage risks, that have know your customer procedures in place, that have compliance staff who are educated and knowledgeable, the sooner they do that as part of their development, the better equipped they are, not just to kind of weather the changes in regulation that are taking place, but they also obtain a competitive advantage, I think, vis-a-vis a lot of others in the space. And so I think it's really important that players in the industry recognize we are at this stage now where regulation is here. I think the question of the panel is, have we gone too far? But I think the fact of the matter is where we are here now. The regulation is here. It's a fact of life. It's not going away. And those businesses that are accepting of that fact are the ones that are going to succeed ultimately.
Thanks, David. Guys, looking at the tools available and the regulatory approach, do you see overlap and synergies as to how one dovetails into the other, or could possibly a more self-regulated environment could have varied given the tools that are available?
If I can start from the gaming side, I think the technology itself, in certain instances, makes compliance easier. I'll give one example. So one of our primary areas of focus as a regulator is to make sure that at the very basic, players' funds are kept safe, and if a player withdraws, wins, the payout arrives. That is one of the basic tenets, obviously, of a proper gaming operator. You take a look at certain implementations of smart contracts, and most of the problem goes away if you ensure that the smart contract itself is effectively producing the outcomes that it claims to produce, which is where other regulatory requirements come in with regards to ensuring that outcome. Then I think there is a very good synergy between what the regulation from a technology perspective is trying to achieve and how the technology then itself can help with compliance from the other regulatory aspect. So I think, yes, they do synergize quite well.
Yeah. Looking at, perhaps Mark or Leonard can address this, looking at the audit, or we're referring to same as the systems audit. However, we've seen applications, mandatory applications for the system auditors where there is a DLT usage or there is interfacing with the DLT. Now, how are you seeing that panning out? And do you envisage that the systems audit should have a broader scope beyond the DLT aspect, or should it be restricted to the DLT?
I think, surprisingly enough, my experience is that most of the service providers are not using any form of DLT whatsoever. So I don't see any benefits of a systems audit within that context. I can understand if there is a shift towards the technology in general, whether it's DLT or anything of the sort. I believe actually earlier during this year, you were chairing another panel during which I said we need to focus more on the fitness and properness of the technology rather than just focusing fitness and properness of the individuals. But perhaps one of the criticisms which you can pinpoint is that the focus seems to be where there is DLT, where there is an innovative technology arrangement according to law. And perhaps, given that most of these products are highly retail and they're large scale, we should also start focusing more on assessing the technology, but it shouldn't be something which is limited to the crypto industry, but it's something which would be more of a fintech initiative, whether it's in traditional regulated space or within the crypto industry. That is something I can see value in.
Dave, within this context, if a tool like yourself was to be subjected to a pre-certification or pre-audit, how would the industry perceive it from that aspect, that it would have already been pre-cleared for usage? Would that be something which would be welcomed from the industry, or
The notion of audit, you mean? Yeah, I mean, I think generally what we're seeing across the industry is a growing acceptance of interaction with regulator and regulatory oversight. So, I think the conversation across a lot of the industry a few years ago is, again, I said, one where there was a lot of, I guess, concern about the notion of you being subject to regulation. But I think, increasingly there's a recognition that among exchanges and cryptocurrency businesses out there that the more sort of forward-leaning they are in terms of kind of proactively embracing regulation and regulatory compliance, the more effective their business can be over time. So, I think, if we had been having this conversation a couple years ago, that sort of thing would not have been quite as readily accepted by the industry. But I think increasingly we're seeing that, the leading players in the industry accept now that this is here to stay.
So one last question. I'm moving away from the Virtual Financial Assets Act, and I'm going to throw in the ITAS, the Innovative Technology Arrangements and Services Act. As you know, it is an opt-in certification process when it's not used in relation to a VFA activity, to put simply. Should that concept be retained in terms of the opt-in approach, or would it be perhaps wise to identify certain areas where mandatory certification, for example, when it's dealing with gaming, be introduced?
We have already, to an extent, imported that in the sandbox. Not the full certification, because some of the requirements are similar in any case. So if you take the technical administrator, we still have requirements in relation to persons performing key functions. If you take the forensic node, we still have certain requirements on replication. Not to the same extent as the full certification, but still. But we do, given that it's a regulated business, we have imported a number of those system audit requirements from the ITAS Act.
I think the regulation is going to continue shifting, as is the technology continuing to shift. So I think, despite we do have a framework and we do have a legislative drive, the concept of having the opt-in or the opt-out retained for other industry, retained for this industry or passport into other industries, I think is going to be totally dependent upon the nature of the technology that we're going to have as this continues developing, especially bearing in mind new technologies or variants of the current technologies we have that are coming through, and bringing in the element of other types of regulation into space. So I think it's a bit difficult for us to say, should we retain it or not? I think in certain areas, yes, you should. In other areas, I don't think it's going to be something which we should be considering retaining. But I think even that concept of considering whether we should keep it or not, or whether, let's say, you're going to have some type of innovative technology that is going to be used within the payment space, and whether the fully fledged ITAS should be applicable with the halls and bells and whistles, I think it's going to be dependent upon that underlying technology and whether there's going to be any issues when it comes to the wider regulatory regime for the payment services entity. And if there's going to be any issues when it comes to potentially passporting that. And our regulation should be morphed and developed in line with the wider European regulations to make sure that we've got the ability to passport.
I think first of all we need to give it a bit more time, in the sense that I believe you only have 4 certified systems auditor right now, maybe 5. So we need to have a decent pool of systems auditors to allow this industry a good chance to take off first. And perhaps we need to have this discussion again in 6 months' time, a year's time. I personally would be favored, and thinking of what I was saying earlier, with perhaps widening the focus, the current focus of the MDIA, moving slightly back just from DLT, but perhaps becoming a body which allows certification of systems auditor across the board. There are systems auditors in gaming, there are systems auditors. There is creeping in the concept of systems auditors within financial services solutions which are heavily reliant on technology. So perhaps you can widen the remit and allow for an authority to supervise systems auditors, or at least to issue guidelines, to create a forum for discussion and so on. But I would stress it should be then technology agnostic, not focusing on DLT.
So, few seconds each. Has Malta over-regulated? So you can, it's a yes/no answer.
I think it hasn't. I think Malta is actually, when it comes to its crypto regulatory framework or virtual asset framework, a bit ahead of the curve. And I think we're going to see other countries kind of get to a similar level over the coming months and years.
I think yes in the ICO space, which was dying a natural death anyway. Otherwise, I think it's too early to recalibrate the level of regulation.
Bluntly, no. No.
In our case, maybe.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for following us, and